Hi everyone. This week's class is on theoretical perspectives on oral language development. And I thought we would start by looking at our focal child observations. I wanted to point out to you that in our book, Literacy Development in Early Childhood by Beverly Otto, in page 41, she starts the chapter that we were reading for this week with a vignette on Eric and his mom walking down the street and them seeing a dog and the mom pointing the dog out to him and he responding. So that vignette, if we look at our template of note-taking, note-making, and learning theory, that vignette would be something that you could note down in the note-taking column. Below that, Otto explains that in Eric's conversation with his mother, she could observe that he was able to understand his mother's initial message. He was able to focus on the unfolding event, and then he was able to express his own thoughts verbally. That would be an inference or an interpretation of what we read in the vignette. So if the vignette goes under the note-taking column, that interpretation would go under the note-making column. And then she goes on to say that Eric is well on his way to developing effective oral language skills, which could go under the learning theory column. So we know that all of those aspects that she interpreted in the note-making column, or that we could jot down under the note-making column, his ability to understand his mother's initial message, his focus on the event that was unfolding, and then his expression, oral expression of his thoughts, all lead us to think then in the learning theory column that he is developing effectively in his oral language, that he is on track, that he is where he should be in terms of abilities of interpretation, of receptive language, and of expressive language and comprehension. So I just wanted to point that out, that there's an example in our chapter readings for this week that we could see as useful for the note-taking, note-making, and learning theory way that we're using, the template that we're using to observe our focal children. We're going to start next week after we observe the children with you guys sharing examples from your notes and what you have observed, the notes that you've taken, the notes that you've made, or the interpretation inferences that you've made, and then how you're connecting it to the theory that we're reading about. So in that light, let's get into some of the theory. So this week, we're focusing on theoretical perspectives of oral language development, and we're looking at the stages. And these stages are fluid stages, so they're not fixed stages. Some children go through them more rapidly than others. Some children could potentially skip over a stage and go into the following one. So they're fluid in the sense that we have an idea of research that has been conducted and observations of children that have been done of when these stages occur, but it's not set in stone. So the first stage is cooing, and actually some researchers sort of skip over this stage and just go into babbling as the first stage, but we do notice that there's a difference between cooing and babbling. So in cooing, there's an extended vowel sound that is uttered by the child, and usually the vowel sounds, the extended vowel sounds, like for example, ah, where you have just the phoneme or the sound associated with one vowel repeated for a period of time. And we found that, or we can see that this cooing, this extended sound, tends to be of vowels first versus consonants. And it happens around 6 weeks of age in infants. And the reason why the sounds for vowels are the ones that are uttered first and more frequently than the consonant ones is because the vowel sounds require less muscle development. So the muscles around the mouth, the jaw, the cheek area that are needed for utterances, for oral enunciation and just uttering words are not necessarily fully developed, and so it's easier for an infant to make cooing sounds of vowels than it is to make cooing sounds of consonants. The second stage then is babbling, and babbling consists of repeating consonant and vowel pairings, sounds, right? So a child will repeat a syllabus that consists of a consonant and a vowel together, like ka, 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 or pa, 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 ma, 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 and repeat that several times. And it's in a talk-like way because it has the intonation and the rhythm of what they're hearing in their native language at home. So it's sort of mimicking the rhythm and the intonation of what they hear their parents or their caregivers say. Echolalia or echolic babbling is when this is happening, that it is mimicking the intonation and the rhythm. So it's a little bit of more advanced babbling than just repeating a consonant vowel sound, which is sort of the initial babbling. The initial more basic babbling happens between 4 and 6 months of age, and the echolalia or echolic babbling happens between 8 and 10 months of age. The third stage of oral language development is the one-word stage, and this is when children start inventing word-like units, but they use it in a consistent basis. So, for example, a child that uses the word titi for the bottle or for the pacifier or for their favorite blanket, and that's the name that they give it, and it's an invented word. It doesn't mean anything, but it's consistently used to denote that particular object. These are called idiomorphs, these word-like units but that are invented and don't really mean anything aside from what the child has given meaning to. Another thing that happens during the one-word stage is that you use more conventional words that really resemble what adults are saying to the child, both in pronunciation and meaning, and they're used to communicate. Like, for example, when the child says wawa for water, it sounds a little bit like water, but it's not quite there. So it resembles the adult pronunciation, and it's a one-word utterance that they can say to communicate. This happens around the first year of age. The fourth stage is the telegraphic stage, and it consists of stringing words together in a sentence-like segment. And children will say, for example, me no sleep, or want bottle now. So it clearly conveys meaning, but it is in a sort of telegraphic sense that the sentence is uttered. So it's like a sentence, but it doesn't have all the components needed for a sentence. And this happens at the toddler age. The fifth and last stage is the beginning of oral fluency. And this happens when the children are beginning to be fluent in their home language, when they begin to ask questions, when language and vocabulary become more and more complex and more similar to the adult-like utterances that they hear. And this happens in the preschool years in ages around 3 and 4. So next we're going to look at the areas of oral language knowledge, and these are areas of knowledge that children are going to be building upon as they learn about language, and there are areas of knowledge that we as adults can provide experience with, so that they increase the knowledge in each of these areas. In Otto's book on page 44, there's a table, 3.1, that has a really good summary of what these areas of language knowledge look like. And she also explains that these areas of knowledge can be used as cueing systems because they help the child understand, decipher the language, and continue to develop in the language. So they give the children cues to continue to develop in their language and literacy development. So the areas of knowledge are 5, and then we're going to see that the metalinguistic area of knowledge is also sort of talked about in this chapter, but it is a 6th area. But she initially talks about 5 of them, and then it sort of includes this one at the end. So phonemic knowledge is the first area of knowledge, and it has to do with the knowledge of sounds and symbols. And it's when the child is able to know that each word, that each letter has a sound, and that if we combine letters together, those letters form a word, and that word, there's a way to pronounce that word. So it's being aware of the sounds that are associated with the letters or the symbols in our language, because not all language have necessarily letters, but others have characters and have other kinds of symbols to their writing. So the second area of knowledge is semantic knowledge, and that's knowledge about word meaning and what each word means. It has to do with vocabulary and acquiring and developing vocabulary over time for them to convey meaning. The third area of knowledge is syntactic knowledge, and has to do with the implicit knowledge of our rules or our grammar. And it has to do with us knowing that words need to be placed in a certain order within a sentence for them to convey meaning to others. The fourth area of knowledge is morphemic knowledge, and it's the knowledge of how words can be changed by adding or subtracting parts of them. So if we add an S, we can get a possessive or a plural. If we add an ED, we can get a past tense, and so on. So it's that knowledge that words can be changed, and as they change, their meaning can change as well, and the way that we use them and what they convey changes. The fifth area of language knowledge is pragmatic knowledge, and pragmatic knowledge has to do with how we use language in different settings or contexts. And children learn that talking and relating and communicating to others in, say, the playground looks different as the way that we do it in the classroom or the way that we do it at home. And it's that awareness that language is going to vary in the way that we use it, depending on the social and cultural setting or context in which we find ourselves. Metalinguistic knowledge has to do with the explicit or conscious knowledge of a specific features of language. And what that allows us is to think about, reflect upon how we use language and be able to talk about it. And as we know that language development or talking or thinking about language is going to help us deepen and make our knowledge of language more complex, and help us understand our knowledge of language so that we can better use it. So metalinguistic knowledge is very important in terms of supporting oral language development. Okay, so one of the things that we know is that the children that come to our classrooms are very diverse, not only in terms of language, but in terms of cultural backgrounds, in terms of practices, in terms of rituals, in terms of customs, in terms of just overall cultural background. So this quote is coming from Sotomayor and Martel's book, and it states, "Young children who are socialized into pragmatic rules that differ from what counts as appropriate in U.S. schools and schooling are often disadvantaged by teachers' expectations that young children would understand how indirectness may specify politeness, how questions may mean commands, and how some questions are not meant to be answered. So these are ways that we know that teachers use in the classroom. Sometimes teachers use indirectiveness to ask children to do things without being direct because they think it's a more polite way to say it if you're indirect. But then some children that come from a different cultural background may misunderstand this and not really get that the teacher is asking them to do this, especially when they're using questions instead of commands. Could you please sit? Well, the child could say, no, I don't want to sit, right? When actually what the teacher is saying is sit down. But instead of saying it as a command, it's said as a question. And for a child that is not used to that kind of communication, it could be puzzling and confusing. So to understand that the expectations that we have of children when we use our reference of communication that's very culturally embedded could be to the disadvantage of some children that are not familiar with that cultural reference that we're using. So think about that when you're thinking about your classroom and the children that work in your classroom and that you work with. So one of the things that Otto says that we can use to support oral language development are interaction patterns. And she talks about these 6 different interaction patterns that can be used by adults and by teachers when we're interacting with children in order to support their language and their oral language development. So one is the shared reference and eye contact. So she says that by establishing eye contact with the child, you're engaging the child in a conversation, and sharing a reference or sharing the object or the situation, making it really evident that that's what we're talking about. And when that is clear and the eye contact is there, then the children are more engaged in participating in the conversation or in the language interaction. So that's one of the aspects or one of the patterns that can be used. Another one is communication loops, and it's practicing turn taking. So even if a teacher or the adult initiates the conversation, to get to a point where the teacher pauses and now it's the child's turn to respond or interject, and then when it's appropriate, then the teacher then interjects or responds, and then the child listens. And having those turn taking or looping conversations is going to help children support and develop their oral language skills. Another interaction pattern is verbal mapping, and verbal mapping is just verbal description of what's happening. Some authors speak of self-talk when the teacher is verbalizing everything that she's doing. So she's putting into word her actions. Others talk about or speak of parallel talk, where the teacher is sitting next to the child and verbally describing everything the child is doing. So putting words to the child's action. So all of this would fall under verbal mapping, which is another interaction pattern. The 4th one is child-directed speech, and it means that we're adapting, the adult is adapting the speech to match the child's skills, or it's directed towards the child. So some examples of child-directed speech are using less complex grammar, using expressive intonation of, raising and lowering your voice and being more expressive so the child comprehends the meaning, using general vocabulary instead of specific words, slowing the pace of the speech, and focusing on the immediate context, on something that's happening right now that the child can really easily perceive and identify as the object of or the context of the conversation. Interaction pattern 5 is linguistic scaffolding, and we scaffold children's language development when we ask questions and promote them to ask questions, when we expand on what they say, when we paraphrase, when we repeat what the utterances that they make. And this is going to help scaffold or support their oral language development. And the last one is mediation, and it's a simplification of the learning tasks. So, for example, if an adult is reading a book to a child and the child is a toddler and their vocabulary is not as advanced to comprehend the book, if the adult read it word for word, then the adult would not read it word for word, but would either talk about the illustrations and have the child point out things that he or she is seeing from the illustrations, or invent words that are sort of age appropriate, that the child would be able to understand, given his or her vocabulary level. So that's mediating the experience so that the child still can participate in it. Okay, so what are some of the things that teachers can do if we know these things, if we know these areas of knowledge, if we know these interaction patterns, if we know these stages of oral development? What can we do to support and help further develop the language in the children? Well, one of the things that we can do is we can highlight key components of social interactions. And Otto talks about two key components of social interactions. One is to engage the child as a partner in communication, to constantly be engaging the child. Even if the child is an infant that can't really respond, engage the child as if you're having a conversation with them, taking cues from the child as sort of responses to the conversation. And the second key component is using effective interaction patterns like the ones that we talked about before, or strategies to keep the child engaged and to keep that engagement going for a longer period of time. So those are some of the things that we can do as teachers and adults trying to support or promote oral language development. But another thing we can do is to foster storying in our classroom. So listening and telling stories from Indigenous, from West African, from African American, from Japanese cultures, and letting the children be the authors of their own stories. So even if we don't have these ethnical cultures represented in our classroom, including them so that we can provide opportunities for children to learn about others. And story acting is another great strategy that we can use. We can ask children to interview family members to get to know their stories, to ask questions from their families and bring them back, to ask questions in the classroom, to have teachers ask questions to the children, games of freeze so that they become aware of their bodies and who they are during circle time, discussing and making characters, and story acting. Story acting is a strategy that consists of acting out a story, either written by the children or written by someone else. And I encourage you to look at Vivian Gusson-Paley's work if you haven't done this already. She was a kindergarten teacher for many years, and she worked at the lab school at the University of Chicago in a kindergarten classroom, and she wrote many books about her classroom and the different strategies that she implemented in her classroom. And one of the ways that she carried out her curriculum was through story acting, and the children would write their scripts and then act them out and choose who would be which character and act out the stories. And that was her primary way of promoting literacy in her kindergarten classroom. And they're a really interesting, flowing kind of read. So it's an easy read and a very enlightening read that comes from a teacher's perspective. Another thing that we can do in the classroom is provide books, and books narrated by others, books that are in video format, books that tell the stories from different cultures. And as I said before, cultures that aren't represented in the classroom is where you want to start from, but not necessarily limit the children to only those cultures. You want them to be exposed to all the different cultural backgrounds and to sort of expand their mind of the different kind of literature that is out there that they could benefit from, and that could definitely increase their vocabulary and help support their oral language development. So what else can teachers do? Well, play is, as we know, the main way, the natural way in which children learn. So provide play, ample time for play allocated in your classroom schedule. So sometimes teachers call this choice time, work time, play time, free play time, nuestro tiempo, as in Jessica Martel's classroom. There's many ways of calling this time, this period of the day, but as long as you have a big chunk of time during the day where children can play, we're ensuring that they are being supported in their oral language development. These are some examples of things that children could do while engaged in play, materials that they can use that you have set up for them in the classroom, and products of their work, and then just interactions, social interactions of working with others and collaborating with others while they play. Another thing that teachers can do is to foster conversations about friendship, fairness, and fantasy. So, and you can do this in morning meetings, you can do this through children's books and children's literature, you can do this through authentic writing experience, asking them to write about friendship, what they know about friendship and fairness and fantasy, and just promote this in the classroom. These are going to be openings into the child's world and help them engage with language and literacy in a very natural kind of way. What else can teachers do? They can bring families into the classroom. So asking families to come and share their backgrounds with you, how they approach literacy and how they engage in oral language development. Spend time with the families outside of the school. Use the literature that provides, as we've talked about before, both windows and mirrors into the children's worlds, and that both reflect who they are but also expand their knowledge of the world. Okay, one of the things that we need to do and need to be mindful of doing, because this could be a very unconscious act on our part as teachers and as adults, is to avoid the deficit mentality or the deficit thinking. So there's a research that's been mentioned in Otto's book, and it's this quote comes from the chapter that we were reading on page 54. And they found that with increased amounts of talking, what happened in households where there was an increased amount of talking, so the adults were talking a lot, what they found was that the children that came from those kinds of households had more developed components of language, and then translated into better or higher skills in literacy as well. And this is true. This was a finding from a research study that was done, and what they were trying to prove is that more than socioeconomical status, it was more about what the parents, the oral language that was being facilitated at home was more of a key indicator of children's language abilities and then literacy skills. Yet not all children are going to come from a cultural background where this is happening. And if we think then that because they didn't have this kind of environment at home, that they're coming in lacking and not having, then we're looking at them from a deficit model or from a deficit perspective, instead of saying, well, this is what they do bring, these are the skills that they do have, and this is the cultural background that they are coming from, and this is what is rich and valued in that cultural background, and those are their assets, and those are going to be this particular child's strengths. If we see it from that perspective, is very different than seeing it from the perspective of, oh, well, we know that this is what children need to bring, and because this child does not bring it, then he or she is at a disadvantage. if we see it that way, we are doing a child a disservice, because we're focusing on the deficit instead of focusing on the asset and the skills that the child brings. So keep that in mind when you're working with children and looking at the expectation of how they should come into your preschool classroom or kindergarten classroom or first grade classroom. What is it that they need to bring from prior experiences, and why do you think that? Are you approaching it from a deficit perspective, using a deficit model of thought, or are you looking at the strengths that the child is bringing into the classroom because of the richness of the cultural and ethnical background that they're coming from? Okay, so lastly, we're going to look at emergent literacy. So emergent literacy is the gradual development of knowledge about reading and writing, right? So literacy is all focused not on oral language, but more on reading and writing skills. And emergent literacy means that these phases, because there's 5 distinct phases through which children go through, these phases then are happening prior to their developing the skill of reading and writing. And that's why it's called emergent, because it's beginning, right? It's starting. So phase 1 is observation. And in phase 1, we're going to see that children are constantly observing the adults around them and how they use language, both oral language, and then how they use their reading skills and their writing skills to communicate and to gather information. And this happens from birth. So from the moment that children can see what's around them, they are getting information and input by observing the adults interact with each other, interact with the environment, and use literacy skills in different ways. The second phase occurs between 2.5 and 4 years of age, and it's exploration. And this is when children begin to explore with the materials around them, and they start looking at print and written materials. They start to pretend to read. They ask adults to read things for them. They manipulate written materials, they interact with them, and they start sort of exploring the world around them, the print world around them. Phase 3 is experimentation, and this usually happens during the pre-KK years. And this is when children start drawing, start scribbling, start using invented spelling, and they're mesmerized with the fact that you can write some symbols and that conveys meaning. And even if it's not conventional spelling, because there's a lot of invented spelling in this phase, that they know that whatever the markings that they do on a piece of paper is going to have some meaning, and they're trying to make that meaning as decodable or decipherable for an adult or for another person that knows how to read as they can, so that the message can get to the reader. Phase 4 has to do with communication. So this happens from kindergarten and above, and it's a combination of invented spelling and conventional spelling used to communicate or get the message across. Again, these phases are also fluid kinds of phases, so which means that the age here is an approximation. Some children go through these stages quicker. Some children go through these stages at a slower pace. So keep that in mind. These are not set in stone. There are markers to give us an idea of when to expect the phase to be occurring in the children. The last phase, phase 5, is when children are using conventional skills for reading and writing, and they can communicate easily. And this happens towards the end of first grade and during second grade is when we can expect this, to observe this in children. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this week's lecture, and as a closing circle, we're not going to do exit slips this time, because we're doing this session online, but I do want to remind you of the homework. The admin slip for next week. Next week is week 5. Is coming from 2 articles that are posted on Blackboard. So we're not going to be reading from Soto, Manning, and Martel or from Otto next week, but we're going to be reading from Allen and Piña et al. There's 2 articles that are posted on Blackboard. And that is it for now, ladies. I will see you again next week. Bye-bye.